Welcome, students. This is our first lecture for this course for Lesson 1 on Reconstruction. And this lecture is entitled The Worst 3 Popular Myths About Reconstruction, because I often see students and the public in general coming to the topic already with a number of preconceived myths that I think should be dealt with right from the beginning. So myth number 1 is even calling the era Reconstruction. All right, I think that's really a bad name for the era. Um, the reason is it wasn't just about Reconstruction, it was about transforming the South, not just building it back up to the way it was, right? Uh, you know, there were over 650,000 Americans killed, thousands of farms pillaged, dozens of cities destroyed. It was America's bloodiest war at the time and still is. And so for these reasons, the Union was determined to make sure that the war had not been in vain, that permanent changes for the good would come out of this war. All right, especially for the wing of the Republican Party known as the Radical Republicans. They were the most committed to making sure that the South would actually change, and that this war wasn't just to put the status quo, put the country back to the way it was, because the way it was had all sorts of problems with slavery and all sorts of things. So no, the Confederate rebels would have to make some changes and sacrifices. And so for this reason, the era of Reconstruction ended up being far from a simple matter of rebuilding farms, railroads, and towns in the South. If the era of Reconstruction had been so simple, so many Southerners surely would have not responded to Reconstruction policies with the hostility that they did. Right? But because these pro-Confederate Southerners were determined to resist these changes to their way of life, this is why this era of Reconstruction was a period that was almost as tense as the Civil War itself, albeit these tensions playing out in the realm of politics rather than through outright war, although there was significant violence on each side during Reconstruction. Especially with white vigilantes under organizations like the Ku Klux Klan trying to take things into their own hands to resist Reconstruction. And then the Union Army having to step in and restore order, as you kind of see in this political cartoon from the time period from Harper's Weekly. All right, in fact, I would argue that Reconstruction is a misleading term for the time period. Perhaps a label given to the time period by historians with a subtle pro-union bias as a way of downplaying the controversy of their actions. Oh, we're just reconstructing the country, no big deal. No, in fact, they're radically trying to transform the country. I would argue for the better, but let's not downplay this. Let's recognize it for what it is. It's a serious change to American society. What African-American historian W.E.B. Du Bois often referred to as the Second American Revolution. Okay, myth number 2 would be Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. This is another idea that one runs into frequently, that Abraham Lincoln was some firebrand crusader against slavery, and that he dedicated his whole political life to ending slavery. This is just not true. This sort of poster is blatantly misleading. Not only because it shows the slaves as kind of groveling and as Lincoln being solely responsible for the emancipation. In fact, it was the slaves themselves who ended their slavery and brought about emancipation largely through running away, both before and during the Civil War. So many slaves were running away by the middle of the Civil War that Lincoln was forced to act. And in fact, Lincoln's first impulse was just to treat the slaves as contraband property to either be returned to their slave owners or to be kept for use by the Union Army. But eventually his generals pressured him to issue an outright Emancipation Proclamation during the war. And even then, the initial Emancipation Proclamation did not free all of the slaves. It only freed the slaves in the rebellious states that had seceded from the Union. There were some states that had stayed with the Union, but still had slavery. And they got to keep their slaves until the very end of the Civil War. So Lincoln was a compromiser. He was lenient on the South. He was not this firebrand great emancipator. It's true that Lincoln personally disliked slavery and often spoke out against it, but he was not prepared at first to abolish slavery. His plan in his 1860 election was initially to allow slavery to continue where it was already legal, but to prohibit its spread into the Western territories. But this was not good enough for some Southerners, for a lot of Southerners. They wanted to be able to sell their slaves farther out west for a good price as the frontier expanded, and this plan of Lincoln's smacked of tyranny to them. So they portrayed Lincoln as this sort of anti-slavery devil, and in a way this image has been ingrained in us, except from the opposite point of view of judgment, where people think, Lincoln's anti-slavery. Well, that means he's the great emancipator, right? If you're against slavery, then, Lincoln seems like some sort of messiah if you believe that he's the main one that's solely responsible for ending slavery. But it's wrong now, and it's a wrong idea back when Southerners had this paranoid idea about it. Lincoln was not some sort of anti-slavery crusader. That title of the Great Emancipator really ought to go to people like Thaddeus Stevens or John Brown. John Brown himself trying to ignite a slave rebellion in the South, for which he was greatly criticized. Including people like Abraham Lincoln criticized John Brown as being too radical. So and when Lincoln actually brought the Union Army into the Civil War, it was not initially to abolish slavery, but to preserve the Union as it was and to bring the South back into the Union, even if that meant keeping slavery in the South at first. And you might ask, well, if it wasn't about ending slavery and about preserving the Union instead, why is that so important? Why is preserving the Union important? Well, it's a matter of getting your tax money, keeping free passage of the Mississippi River, not having a powerful competitor suddenly on your southern border, keeping control of federal property like Fort Sumter. Any government is not going to let parts of its territory just split off willy-nilly. And that's initially what Lincoln was focused on, was preserving the Union, keeping those states in the Union, keeping the tax money coming in from the South, keeping control over federal property in the South. That's more of what it's about at first than ending slavery. In fact, Lincoln says, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save this Union. So the Union is most important for Lincoln, not the slaves. Why is this important to cast aside this myth of Lincoln as the great emancipator? Well, it's important to realize that Lincoln was not alone, and that a lot of the North was also kind of hesitant on the whole issue of ending slavery, especially so drastically as it happens during the Civil War. Not all Northerners wanted to fight the South. Of those Northerners who wanted to fight the South, not all cared about the slavery issue. They wanted to fight the South for other reasons, such as to preserve the Union, like Lincoln did. And of those Northerners who did want to end slavery, not even all of them wanted to end slavery because they cherished African Americans or wanted to uplift the slaves. A lot of them didn't care about the slaves themselves so much. They had their own self-interested reasons for wanting an end to slavery, such as the free soil movement that wanted land out west, didn't want to have to compete with wealthy plantation owners bringing their slaves into the West. Some people didn't like competing against cheaper slave labor, so they didn't really care so much about the slaves per se. They just, they felt like they could benefit by an end to slavery. So there's all sorts of reasons for ending slavery that had nothing to do with what we think of as abolitionism, meaning this kind of moral crusade to end slavery just because it's wrong, just for the sake of the slaves' well-being. And a lot of people weren't thinking along those lines. And, Lincoln arguably be among those, that he was not this firebrand crusader who wanted to end slavery, soldiers in the Union Army felt likewise. Here's a quote from a private letter of an anonymous Union soldier. says the soldiers unanimously want to go home and let the Southern Confederacy, Negroes, our own administration, and all go to the devil together and save what they can for themselves and of themselves. Many are sick of fighting if it is purely on the Negro question, and now that it really seems to be made the whole question, or to determine who shall or shall not be the next president and whose friends shall do the big stealing, or what is the same thing, manage the contract business. So here's a Union soldier from the 12th Vermont Militia saying, we're kind of sick of fighting if it's, if it's about helping the Negroes, quote unquote, or, enriching war profiteers. We're sick of it. So it's important to realize that the North was not a solid united front on ending slavery immediately. And Lincoln, among them, also was not solidly in favor of ending slavery. And even when he did end slavery, he was hesitant about going much farther than that, about making the ex-slaves actual equal American citizens with the right to vote and whatnot. Lincoln was not too sure about that. And we forget about this in mythologizing Lincoln. So myth number 3, this comes especially from the South in the years after the Civil War, that the Union occupation after the Civil War was merciless on them and that the South was purely innocent and just beaten and battered. So one part of this myth is that the South suffered from a plague of ex-slaves who roamed around like deranged zombies, chasing helpless white women, trying to bully and rape them. This sort of idea was propagated in the famous film from 1915 called Birth of a Nation, where basically it argues that these chivalrous Ku Klux Klan members and their vigilante justice, meaning hanging, lynching African Americans, the idea in this film is that that's the only thing standing between the South and chaos and having all its white women raped. It's incredibly racist, of course. And this myth gets propagated even though I don't know of a single actual example of this sort of behavior from the ex-slaves. Even though you might have thought, one might expect that some of them would want some sort of revenge, but even so, they showed themselves to be particularly well behaved and not unhinged. So the fact that this myth gets perpetrated about them regardless is really shameful that the South does this. In fact, violence in the South after the Civil War almost always, I would almost say always, came from whites first, And then even then, usually ex-slaves did not retaliate because to do so was way too dangerous. It would invite even worse reprisal from white supremacist groups. And then another part of this myth is that the South was ravaged by war and by the occupation after, despite being purely innocent and having nothing to do with all this. But in fact, and Gone with the Wind, if you've ever seen this movie, it's an old-timey movie, but it portrays this view to a T. But in fact, a lot of the South's suffering came from its own decisions during Reconstruction. That it didn't have to suffer so much. In fact, white Southerners would not have had nearly as hard of a time after the Civil War if they had not been so stubborn in fighting these changes that the Union forced upon them. Because at first, the changes that the Union demanded were very lenient. All right? The first phase of Reconstruction, sometimes called presidential Reconstruction, it was very lenient. All the South had to do was ratify the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, and agree to the 10% plan, where 10% of white male Southerners had to swear a loyalty oath to the Union. Only 10%. And then their states would be let back into the Union with all the rights of states. This is Lincoln's plan. Lincoln was assassinated, of course. Andrew Johnson becomes president and largely follows through on this plan, which, interestingly enough, Andrew Johnson gets criticized for being too lenient on the South and is made out to be one of the worst presidents in American history, which makes you think that if Lincoln had not been assassinated, it's possible his legacy might not have been as romanticized and celebrated, because now we'd be blaming Lincoln for being too lenient on the South. Of course, it's hard to say. Maybe Lincoln would have changed his mind over time, but in any case, Andrew Johnson wasn't that different from Lincoln, and he got criticized left and right for being too lenient on the South. Andrew Johnson even had additional demands on the South, such as that they formally revoke their acts of secession, where they declared their independence, and that they disavow paying back any Confederate debt, any debt incurred in their own Confederate currency during the Civil War. Southern pride was just too bitter to accept even these minor humiliations. They could not let go of their dreams of white supremacy, and they once again had this myth that the ex-slaves would be out for revenge if Southerners, let down their guard, and so Southerners felt like they needed to bring blacks back under their control, and they realized they couldn't do this by reinstituting slavery, of course. And it's worth noting that a lot of the slaves were already heavily under the control of whites just through their economic circumstances. There was little to no land redistribution to the ex-slaves. Ex-slaves did not get these 40 acres and a mule that they were promised, or that it was. There was a rumor around at the time for a while that slaves would be getting this land. They ended up not getting that, because that would have meant redistributing land from the wealthy white plantation owners. And Lincoln and Andrew Johnson were not that radical. A lot of the slaves were stuck as sharecroppers or heavily in debt. But even that wasn't good enough for white Southerners. They wanted to control blacks even more, so they instituted these so-called black codes. And there were two types of black codes: vagrancy laws, which said that police could arrest people for idling in public, which was interpreted very expansively, and then apprenticeship laws, which meant that parents could have their children taken away from them under very flimsy pretexts, and then those children could be made to do basically slave labor for plantation owners in the community, and supposedly to train them as apprentices. But really, this was sort of like slavery by another name. And Congress was outraged by the South trying to do this, so they demanded even tougher measures against the South. Okay, this initial stubbornness from the South ignites a second phase where Congress gets a little more tough, where they institute the Freedmen's, or they extend the Freedmen's Bureau, which gave immediate cash assistance to ex-slaves and helped them learn to read. Ex-slaves were in very desperate circumstances in this time period, so it was understandable they needed a little bit of help, right? So Congress extended the Freedmen's Bureau and forced Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, requiring equal protection under the law and citizenship for African Americans. Southerners were furious. Once again, they responded, stubbornly, and launched race riots in major cities in the South. And once again, the North responded to this by toughening up even more. They said, you're going to challenge our authority. We're going to make it even harder on you. We're going to elect these radical Republicans who want to go the farthest in changing the South. So this leads us to phase 3, where these radical Republicans come into power in Congress, and they pass the Military Reconstruction Acts that put the South under indefinite military occupation. They insist that the South ratify the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing that blacks get the right to vote. So by this point, you've had the 13th Amendment, freeing them from slavery, the 14th Amendment, making them equal citizens, and now the 15th Amendment, giving them the right to vote. It's a big deal, right? And the South responds to this once again with stubbornness and violence, setting up organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, which in response, Congress passes the Enforcement Acts to try to hunt down the Ku Klux Klan. All right, so this escalation might have continued even longer if it weren't for other issues that started to distract the North, like economic crises. There was a banking panic in 1873, a big railroad strike in 1877. There's political corruption. Eventually, people in the North get tired of having to drag the South along. People in the North, who a lot of them already were not super committed to equality for blacks. You know, part of how the radical Republicans are able to briefly rise to power is just out of the spite of Northerners wanting to punish the South for the South being so stubborn. But after a while, voters in the North kind of lose interest in changing the South for good. They stop enforcing Reconstruction policies. They pull the Union Army out of the South, especially after this corrupt bargain where basically the Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes is the presidential electors install him as the president in return for a promise to withdraw from the South and go easy on the South from then on. Once again, our electoral college system, that's a whole other story, how messed up our presidential elections are. But in any case, once the North stopped supervising the South and pulled the Union Army out, the South started to find all sorts of loopholes around these Reconstruction policies. They started to eventually reinstitute Jim Crow segregation and so on until we get to the 1950s and 60s when African Americans in the South still don't really have equal rights, still aren't able to exercise their equal rights that they're supposed to have on paper due to things like the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. All that's undermined by the South until the 1950s and 60s, which we'll get to later on.